I'm Sarah Young. I work for a cloud consultancy called Versent. I help people move their stuff into the cloud securely. What that means is talking to clients, helping them understand how we can move things in, and then when things are in the cloud, how we can run them securely, obviously with automation and things like that. I've worked in tech for about 9 years now. I've terrorized Europe, New Zealand, and I moved to Australia in February. So now I'm here. I'm actually properly moving to Melbourne in a few months' time, although everything you will read about me says I currently live in Melbourne, but I'm actually in Sydney. I like to overuse memes and GIFs, or GIFs, however you want to say it. Won't go there. Yeah, sometimes they will have nothing to do with my talk, like this one. Sometimes they will. I'm not a Christian author. Having two very common first and last names. I'm not a Christian author. I'm not the woman who was having a baby in the hospital at the same time I was having an operation. And I'm also not a late 80s porn star, which I couldn't do a slide of, so yeah. Feel free to look that up if you want to. But before I go any further and get into my talk, I wanted to say happy GDPR Day, because today, yay! Today is the day that GDPR becomes enforceable. Now, I know there will be some security people in here, but a lot of you are more development thing, but everyone loves this. I mean, who's been getting millions of emails about GDPR? We've updated our privacy policy. Do you want to still have our emails? Yeah, that was just because it was topical today. So yeah, Santa Claus is in trouble. So is like everyone else who makes a list ever. So this is a good opportunity, though, to, as I was reminded by a friend, that you can use all the emails where they're asking you, oh, do you subscribe to this? Do you still want our emails? It can remind you to go and tidy up your accounts where you've got passwords where you've used the same password for the last 10 years. Or rather, that's what I've been using it for, as a reminder to tidy up my accounts. So go and do that. So on to my talk. This is my contribution to this meme that's going around at the moment on Twitter. I thought it was hilarious, and I got more likes than any other tweet I've ever done. I don't have loads of Twitter followers, though, so I was pretty pleased. So what I'm going to talk about today, as I said before, I'm a security person. I don't come from a development background. I was a network engineer. So I know routing and switching and all of that pretty well, rather than applications. But what I wanted to talk to you about is threat modeling. I'm sure you've heard of it. It sounds quite cool, but I'm not assuming that, as you're probably more development people, that you know lots about it. And I wanted to talk about it in the context of containers. And also, I wanted to look at the key security threats for containers, and then we'll have a quick overview of some of the tools that you can use to mitigate some of these threats. Now, I'll say in advance, I've only got half an hour, so we're going to look at it at a very high level. And as I didn't have too much notice, as Angie said, to make this talk, I wasn't testing the demo gods. So no demos from me, sorry. Everyone else seemed to do them, but yeah. So threat modeling, you've probably heard of it. It sounds cool. I like the Hawaii GIF there, because I was just there recently. Yep, just before the volcano erupted. There's lots of different methodologies. There's Dread and Stride. They're Microsoft. There's also OWASP, which is if you do any web development, you'll be familiar with OWASP. It's the Open Web Application Security Project. And then there are these funky ones called Trike and Pasta, which I've never heard of, but they came up on Google, so I thought it was quite cool. I think basically with threat modeling, most people just try to think of a good acronym and then make words to fit, but hey. So threat modeling, these words you will have heard your security people and your risk people and your compliance people and your auditors throw around all the time, but I will tell you security people use them incorrectly all the time. So I'm just going to run through them. I stole this from the Microsoft definition, but everyone pretty much uses the same. So an asset is a resource. Usually data. We'll just leave it at that. A threat is something that can damage your resource, your asset. And a vulnerability is a weakness. So a vulnerability could be a 0-day, it could be misconfiguration, it could be people. In fact, normally it's people, let's be honest. Attack is something that exploits a vulnerability. And a countermeasure is a tool or something you do to address that threat. and then it mitigates your risk. I realize this is probably, if you're all kind of starting to fall asleep, I realize that I'm starting to sound really like an auditor, and I promise it gets slightly more technical in a minute. Promise. So this is the security circle of life. I stole this from the internet, and it says circle of risk, and I was too lazy to change it from risk to security, but this is kind of the circle that we have. So we go around. We have your assets get compromised by threats, which materialize by attacks, which are exploited by which exploit vulnerabilities, which expose you to risk, which is what your auditor and compliance people really love, and security people to a certain extent. But as you can tell, I'm probably trying and failing to separate us security people and auditors, though we kind of do the same thing to a certain extent. And your risks are mitigated by countermeasures that protect your assets. So this goes round and around and around and around constantly. And that's really important to understand, that this is an iterative process. It's a cycle. It never stops. So why should you do that with containers? Actually, going back to the reason I'm here. Nothing's totally secure. Nothing. But in this context, I'll stick with, that's a far bigger discussion, but we'll stick with containers. Your environment is unique. Whatever environment you have in your business, your organization, your client, everyone's got something different. Even if it's a copy of someone else's, there will be little nuances. It could be just a change of firewall rule. It could be some kind of system call, or just a tiny piece of code that's different. So one person's really severe threat is not necessarily another person's, and that's really important to understand. Threat modeling is really useful to kind of have a structured way of working through security controls. Now, you may be thinking, yeah, I'm a developer, this is my security person's problem. But as we move more into DevOps and DevSecOps, all of this is amalgamating together, as I'm sure you're all aware, and probably at different stages in your journey with having to do that. So everyone's having to kind of overlap a bit and start thinking about what traditionally might have been quite siloed. And finally, it helps you communicate to your non-technical stakeholders. Because, let's be honest, non-technical stakeholders normally have budget that pay for tools that are normally your countermeasures that fix your threats or protect against your threats. And the last thing is your threat landscape changes constantly. So, what is a threat? This is our good friend Kim Jong-un. We were friends with him yesterday, or rather America was friends with him yesterday, and my phone buzzed me this morning, and apparently we're now no longer friends, and him and Trump aren't going for a hug later on in Singapore. So, threats are changing all the time. I think North Korea will be there all the time, but yeah. So you do need to keep doing this all the time, because it is going to change. So for containers, I'm not going to sort of labor this point, but containers are different to VMs. They're different to traditional application deployments. So they do have different threats. Some of them overlap still, but they may materialize in different ways. The vulnerabilities to exploit them might be different. So you should be looking at containers as a separate thing. What I've seen is, in my experience, is that in businesses, what they'll do is they will look at their virtual machine, say, hey, a VM? That's basically like a kind of container. So we'll just apply everything we've got to our VM to a container. This is wrong. We know this is wrong. So, yeah. You should be doing it specifically for containers. And as containers become more prolific and people are using them more and more, they're not kind of a niche thing anymore. It's really important that people pay attention to this. So I'm going to look at some common security threats and a few tools. Like I said previously, this is not an exhaustive list of tools by far. I think I'm going through 6 of them. So, there's plenty more out there, and I'm not trying to say, hey, these are the best, because it depends. But just a quick recap of your container implementation models. I'm aware that this is not a container implementation model. This is virtual machines. But we have containers on bare metal and containers on VMs. My point with this slide was that I like the diagram, and that virtual machines, as you can see, are not the same. Not laboring that point, because I'm sure you all understand that. So, top threats to containerized environments. I have taken this from a NIST document. If you're not familiar with NIST, it's the US government standards for various different things. Recently, they published in November last year a document about container security and container threats. Now, it's actually quite a good document. NIST varies a bit on how interesting and useful it is, but it's not too long. It's 10 pages maybe. You can download it off the website, and I'll have the link later. And it gives a really good summary of the threats that containers are subject to. So as you can see, we've got container images. I also realized that going on Friday was definitely a mistake here, because loads of these have been touched on yesterday's talks. But at least I've gone before everyone else in security, because they're probably going to talk about them more after me. So it's pretty good. I'm in the middle at least. I don't look like I've plagiarized everyone. So our top threats are container images. Again, we've definitely touched on that one. Your orchestrator or your control channel images, control channel threats, registry threats, your host OS threats, and runtime environment. So first tool, I realize I've gone straight into audit. Sorry. This is Docker bench security. Now, when we look at auditing tools kind of, they address kind of all the threats roughly across the whole landscape, because I'm not going to say for a second that an audit tool is going to secure your container and it's not going to secure your environment, but audit tools do have their uses. What the audit tools do is they help to build your security baseline. They run through a load of basic tests, and they basically tell you if you've just been a container noob or you've hard failed at doing some really basic configuration. Docker bench security has been around for a while. I'm sure plenty of you are using it. It tests against the Center for Internet Security 1.6 benchmark and Docker best practices. It basically just gives you nice little you have failed messages or you are fine messages. So it's going to help you just check that you haven't done anything really basically wrong, because a lot of security threats and vulnerabilities come from some really basic mistakes or a chain of basic mistakes, and that's really important to remember to get your hygiene right. And if any of you follow the ASD, they did used to have top 4, but they've recently changed it to the essential 8. It's all about hygiene, making sure you're patched, making sure your INAM is right, et cetera, et cetera. And this applies to containers. Another audit tool is OpenSCAP. You could well use this because it comes in other forms. The Docker form is specifically written for assessing containers. This one is a bit more audity because it specifically talks about standards like PCI DSS, which is for if you hold credit card information. STIGs, they are the US Department of Defense literal guidelines for configuration. If you've ever had the misfortune to have to do a host assessment against a STIG, it's about 500 lines of checking registry keys, at least in Windows, and it makes you regret your existence hugely. I've done it. And FISMA is the US, one of the US government data handling standards. Now, I realize these are kind of a lot of American standards, but some of these are relevant. And the Australia doesn't have an equivalent to STIG, so I've seen a lot of businesses and government departments just use STIG because it's pretty good. It just makes you lose the will to live. So this is, again, good for if you're in a highly regulated industry like financial services or the government. This is good with your certification and accreditation processes and audit activities. And again, it will just throw out if you've just really failed. I'm trying not to say fuck up, but because that's basically what it's there for, and it is useful. And it's a tool, so you don't have to do it yourself, which is even better. So runtime for security, SELinux, which again, I'm sure lots of you have come across in non-container type implementations. It's a kernel security module. It will give additional access control. If you go full on with it, you can implement a mandatory access control, which is more associated with top secret government access control things. I probably wouldn't recommend it for most people. It's got a reputation for being really tricky to run, but I think in the last couple of years, it's really developed as a product, and it's now pretty easy unless you start doing custom rules, which you shouldn't really need to. This is my personal opinion. I think it needs to be monitored because although it will stop and block things, if no one's sort of looking at those logs to see if it stops or blocks things, it's actually not that useful. Like it's not helping you improve how you configure things generally, or possibly find some kind of attacker or APT, which is Advanced Persistent Threat. We'll go back to our good friend North Korea. And if North Korea is sitting in your container or in your sort of whole infrastructure, you need to be looking at logs and actually digesting them to be able to pick up on those things. Some of these runtime security tools can also help with your control channel and your orchestrator, depends on what there is. And some honorable mentions out there go to AppArmor and AquaSec. Hello, if you're there, AquaSec, I know you guys are here. So yeah, you need to have a look at what works for you guys. Like I said, I'm not trying to sell you any particular product because no one gave me commission, so. Next one, we've definitely talked about this, and I'm not going to go into this in a lot of technical detail because if you weren't here last year and you haven't seen it somewhere else, Scott over there did a really good in-depth technical talk about how Claire worked, and I probably couldn't be that articulate with how digital signing works. So all I'm going to say is Docker also do an image repository called Notary. It digitally signs images, it uses the update framework to make sure the OS is up to date, and it allows you to verify that the content you're downloading actually comes from that user. I would say, again, disclaimer, my personal opinion, that image security is probably one of the biggest challenges we've got going with containers, because if you pull an image and you don't know where it comes from, or you don't know that you can't verify that it comes from who it says it does, there could be anything in there. And then you're loading up some malware or some dodgy code, and it's running in your container, and potentially that's game over. So if you pick one thing that you want to kind of concentrate on, make it this, please, please. Like, this is important because, yeah, as you know, containers run with elevated privileges. So if you put dodgy stuff into your container, from a security perspective, home run, So there's Heuristics, or IDS, which is Intrusion Detection System, if you're not familiar with the acronym. I picked, for this talk, Sysdig Falco. It's based on Sysdig, which you may, again, have already used in other open source implementations. Yeah, and it detects, as many IDSs do, anomalous activity within containers. So if your container is only supposed to be talking to container A is only supposed to be talking to container B on port 80, and it starts talking on billions of different ports, or it starts doing crazy system calls, this should be picking up on it. Again, I'll say, like with the runtime security, it's all well and good at picking up on it, but someone needs to be looking at this stuff and actually paying attention to it. So if you're doing, this is kind of edging into operations, I realize, but as we sort of all shift to the left, everything's becoming so much more amalgamated that developers are thinking about ops, are thinking about security, that is DevSecOps after all. But yeah, you need to be thinking about how it's all well and good implementing these security tools, but you need to have someone actually digesting the output and doing something meaningful. Like, you can't just set them to run and leave them. So Sysdig Falco's got a lot of container-friendly default rules, and I'm like one of those people who's an advocate of working smarter, not harder. So if it's a new tool and it's got lots of nice defaults, use them to start with whilst you're learning the product. Don't go like straight in and be like, yo, I'm going to configure like all these rules and then I've just broken my container. Or you'll end up with that, which is, this isn't mine, I got this from Twitter, but I love it. You'll be getting loads of false positives. If you put it in a blocking mode, your IDS will start to actually affect how your container runs, and that's how IDSs end up getting taken away from containers, or even other systems, and yeah, not useful. Right, Rancher. This is the tool that I picked for orchestrator security. Now, I'm aware Rancher is not just a orchestrator security tool. It's a management tool for Kubernetes. But what it does do, it enables centralized policy management. This is the thing I really like about it. And it integrates with directories to enforce your access control policies from AD or whatever you're using. And In terms of access management, that's really important because you can't have access repositories everywhere and unless they're all synced or just using something as the one source of truth, they're going to get messy. People are going to forget to downgrade privileges, like escalate privileges as appropriate, and like misconfigured IAM is such a huge security vulnerability just in IT in general. So, if you've got management tools and you can get them integrated, do it. Couldn't find anything interesting from Rancher for a picture, so because Rancher has like a Highland cattle, I picked cute calf, which has nothing to do with anything, but it's adorable, so yeah. Vulnerability scanning, not on commission from Tenable, just quite like their GUI. Tenable's container scanning product is called Flawcheck, or rather it was, and then they bought Flawcheck, and now they're kind of bigging it up as container security. I don't know. I've seen different things now. I'm not sure what it's officially called at the moment. It's vulnerability scanners, I'm sure everyone's used before, or you've had people come in and do an audit on you or a penetration test, and you've probably seen the output of a vulnerability scanner. Most normal vulnerability scanners can't look in containers, but now there are several coming onto the market that are actually container specific. Tenable's got a nice GUI, and this one, like other ones, will integrate into your CI/CD pipeline, and they will scan at test, which is great because then before you actually deploy something, there's a vulnerability if it's found anything, which is really useful because, again, vulnerability scans are quite general. They're going to pick up on a number of different potential threats. It could just be misconfiguration. It could be your OS is out of date. You've got this port open, whatever it is. It can scan your orchestrator, and I know that Twistlock also do a scanner. I'm pretty sure Aqua do as well. Sorry, I didn't put you on the slide. And yeah, so these are really easy to run. You set it and go. It churns out a nice report that's nice and easily digestible. So yeah, you should be using one. There are some open source ones. I realize all the ones I've mentioned here are paid for, but there are a few open source ones. I think I tend to lean towards liking the paid for ones a bit more for vulnerability scanning, but hey. So where do they fit into container architecture? Going back to this lovely diagram where I have removed the virtual machines, pretty much everything works at the container level. I thought this was a really great idea and then realized all my arrows were basically pointing at the containers. So I left it in there, I don't know why. So everything pretty much works in the container, apart from Rancher and Notary, which floats around ephemerally, kind of around here in the cloud or the internet, whatever you want to call that bit. So basically everything's working at your container level, but they are container-specific tools, which is really important because normal tools don't work amazingly well, no matter what they tell you. Probably shouldn't say that, but if you've got vendors telling you that it just works fine as it is, container architecture doesn't really fit with that. But yeah, so even more tools and the future. I have no idea how I'm doing for time here, so I'm just going to keep going. There's loads more tools. Like if you Google Docker security tools or Docker tools, like you'll get like hundreds of them. And I've just picked a few of them. Mostly I haven't talked about commercial tools because I don't want to pay for them. And so it's a little bit, and demo versions don't give all the stuff I want to do. But something, again, that I've talked about all the way through is that one organization's tool that's best for them isn't necessarily the best for another. And that's all to do with your threat modeling. Coming back to my point, is it's all about threat modeling. And because no one has an identical environment, one tool that's good for one company may not be the best tool for another. So you need to actually work through this process, work out, hey, what are the biggest threats to our organization? What tools fit with that? Because although lots of the tools will offer similar things, there'll be nuances between them. So your product evaluation is quite important. Now, as developers, I'd probably offload that stuff to your security people, but you guys can explain and help them understand exactly what, how the nuances in your container environment. So you do need to work together on it. Threat modeling should be reassessed as regularly as your resources allow because, North Korea might be friends with us again tomorrow, so you might be able to score them off. But yeah, then there's China and Russia and hey. And there's also, you've got your criminals as well. I've gone on about state-sponsored stuff, but the script kiddies and all kinds of stuff. But work with your security teams. Last point, security, we're not that bad. I know that in some organizations we have a rep for being unapproachable, saying no, business prevention officers, no people. I've heard all of these things against myself. We're really not though, and as we move more into DevSecOps, we really need to be more collaborative. I know it sounds really cheesy and yeah, but it is actually true because DevSecOps and DevOps aren't gonna work well unless we work together a lot more closely and actually share and kind of cross-skill a bit. Because what we don't want is, fail, there you go. There you go, I actually failed on the fail well slide. We don't want the fail well, even though that's Twitter and not containers, I just, Docker whale. We want this, which is my favorite 80s bad translation of video game. We want winners, container winners. These are my useful documents and links. The NIST is the NIST special publication. I would really recommend going to read that. It's pretty accessible. If you didn't see Scott Coulson's talk, it's on YouTube. I would recommend watching that because he actually explains this technically, unlike me, who's just gone through it at lightning speed. And also, I have not tried to insult you by putting up some of these things you could Google yourself. And we've got some of the threat modeling down the bottom. Microsoft have this threat modeling tool, which is quite fun to mess around with. So you don't even have to think through it yourself. You can just put some things in to a website. That is the end of my talk. Thank you.